What if I told you that the next major geopolitical conflict might not begin with missiles, tanks, or fighter jets? It could begin with someone sitting behind a computer, and the target might not be a government. It could be your bank, your telecom provider, a satellite, a shipping company, or even the company you work for. The uncomfortable reality is that the cyber war has already started, and something important has changed. The technology itself is not necessarily new. What's changed is who can use it, how cheaply they can use it, and how much help AI can give them. For years, sophisticated cyber capabilities were largely the preserve of major powers, the US, China, Russia, Israel, and a few other countries. But that world is changing very quickly, and I think the consequences are much bigger than most people realize. Because cyber warfare is becoming something much more important than just an IT problem. It's becoming an instrument of geopolitics, and increasingly, private companies are ending up directly in the middle of it. But there are some people who are not very surprised about this. One of the most interesting things about a recent hacking summer camp in Las Vegas is how differently cybersecurity professionals and everyone else tend to look at the same event. Inside the cybersecurity community, things that sound terrifying to the rest of us can be almost routine for them. AI-assisted attacks, state-linked groups inside critical infrastructure. These are not necessarily revelations to people who work in the industry. They've been watching these capabilities develop for years. But take exactly the same event and put that into a newspaper headline, and suddenly it's a geopolitical crisis. I was reminded of this recently during a discussion on AI-driven attacks against Japanese government systems, including the nuclear safety regulator and energy companies. My initial reaction was fairly simple. Technically, there wasn't much that surprised me, but a colleague saw it completely differently. He was much more interested in geopolitical significance. And the interesting thing is that we're both right. He was looking at the technology, and I was looking at who was using it and why. But there was one detail that I thought was particularly significant. The operation reportedly used self-hosted AI infrastructure and open models. In other words, the attackers weren't necessarily relying on a commercial AI platform that could monitor what they were doing or shut them down. They could run the technology themselves. And this is where I think the story becomes much more interesting, because AI is changing the economics of cyber warfare. People often talk about AI making cyber attacks more sophisticated. I'm not convinced that's the most important change. The bigger change may be that AI makes cyber capabilities more accessible. Think about how conventional military works. You need money, equipment, training, logistics. You need thousands of people. But cyber is different. You can have a relatively small group of people operating from almost anywhere in the world. And now AI can potentially compensate for some of the expertise that they don't have. And here's the uncomfortable part. Most successful cyber attacks don't require some extraordinary piece of technology. They often rely on incredibly boring weaknesses, an exposed system, a phishing email, weak authentication, old software. The defender has to secure everything. The attacker only has to find one way in, and AI makes searching for that weakness cheaper and potentially much faster. And that means the number of people and organizations capable of conducting meaningful cyber operations can increase dramatically. That's a geopolitical change, because suddenly cyber capability isn't just something that belongs to the world's most powerful countries. It becomes a general purpose instrument of statecraft. But the most important cyber attack may be the one you never hear about. There's another concept now, I think, which is particularly important, and it explains why we shouldn't judge the cyber threat simply by looking at the number of spectacular attacks appearing in the news. The most important cyber operation may be the one that never makes the news. Why? Because access itself is valuable. Now imagine spending years getting into an adversary's infrastructure. You found a vulnerability. You've established a foothold. You can see what's happening in the system. Why would you immediately use that capability? If you launch a destructive attack, the target will discover how you got in, and then the door gets closed. You've lost your access. So there is a rational reason for states to remain quiet. This is particularly important when we look at the US and China. There is an enormous cyber competition between them, but that doesn't necessarily mean they're constantly trying to knock each other's systems offline. A lot of the competition is about positioning, establishing access, understanding infrastructure, creating options, preparing for a future conflict, and that is much harder to see. You can see a missile, you can see a military exercise, you can see a warship approaching your coastline, but you may not see a cyber foothold sitting quietly inside a network for months or years, and that makes cyber warfare fundamentally different from conventional warfare. And cyber warfare is giving middle powers a new form of leverage. So this brings us to another development that I think is going to become increasingly important. Cyber is becoming an equalizer for middle powers, not because it makes them as powerful as the US or China. It doesn't. But because it gives them another way to impose costs on much stronger adversaries. Iran is a useful example. Iran doesn't have the conventional military capability of the US, but it doesn't need to. Cyber provides another mechanism for signaling retaliation and pressure. And this is particularly important when civilian infrastructure becomes involved. Water systems, hospitals, energy infrastructure, telecommunications. These systems aren't just technical assets. They are part of functioning of society. And once you threaten them, you have leverage. That's why I think the proliferation of cyber capability is potentially more significant than simply having more hackers. We're moving towards a world where more countries can impose costs on one another without necessarily firing a shot. And that makes the geopolitical environment considerably more complicated. But there is a big problem. Who actually sets the rules? There have been international attempts to create norms around cyber warfare. The UN established a permanent forum on responsible behavior in cyberspace. There are also efforts to regulate the commercial intrusion market. But the fundamental problem is enforcement. You can create a rule, but who enforces it? And even if Washington and Beijing agree on something, does that agreement necessarily constrain Tehran or Pyongyang or a smaller state? This is one of the most defining characteristics of the current geopolitical environment. The world is becoming more fragmented. There is less agreement about rules, and cyber capabilities are spreading at exactly the same time. That's not a particularly reassuring combination. The internet was designed to be decentralized and resilient. It was not designed to referee geopolitical competition between countries. And now we're asking infrastructure built for one purpose to deal with a completely different problem. Now, this is the part I want to discuss which companies should really care about. This is where I think the story becomes particularly relevant to businesses, because the infrastructure at the center of this conflict is increasingly commercial. Telecom companies, cloud providers, hyperscalers, data centers, software companies. These aren't necessarily defense companies, but they're increasingly part of national security. Ukraine provides a very good example. During the opening stages of Russia's invasion in 2022, Ukrainian government systems, registries, and archives were moved onto foreign commercial cloud infrastructure. Commercial cybersecurity companies helped identify and mitigate attacks. A satellite operator helped keep the country connected. These companies were not armies, but they became part of the country's wartime infrastructure. And that raises a very good question. What happens when a private company becomes strategically important to a government without ever choosing to become a strategic asset? That's the problem corporate boards and companies need to start thinking about, because traditional enterprise risk management isn't necessarily designed for this. You can assess cyber risk, you can assess operational risk, you can assess supply chain risk. But can you properly assess the risk that your company becomes caught in a geopolitical conflict? What happens if a government asks you to participate in an offensive cyber operation? What happens if another government retaliates against you because of something your government did? At what point does defending your company becomes participation in statecraft? Those boundaries are becoming increasingly blurred. So where does this go next? Where do I think this goes from here? I see 5 things happening. First, attribution becomes harder. As attackers increasingly use self-hosted AI systems and distributed infrastructure, identifying who's actually responsible becomes very difficult. And when attribution is uncertain, retaliation becomes harder. Second point, cyber operations become continuous. Instead of occasional major attacks we could see persistent low-level probing, constant scanning, constant attempts to find vulnerabilities. A lot of it won't make the news, and that's precisely the problem. Point number 3, more countries will openly acknowledge offensive cyber capabilities. Some will put them into law and establish formal rules. Others will deliberately maintain ambiguity. Both approaches have strategic advantages. The fourth point, the themes become increasingly important. The infrastructure connecting our digital world may become particularly attractive. Subsea cables, satellite infrastructure, data center connectivity. These systems are incredibly important, but responsibility for them is often divided between governments and private companies. And finally, point number 5 is the wild card. A cyber incident involving serious casualties or major economic disruption could eventually force governments to confront the fact that the existing system is not working. But if that happens, the conversation may begin only after something has gone very badly. So, this brings me back to where we started. The cybersecurity professionals are right. A lot of the technology is not new, but the geopolitical analysts are right also. Something has changed. The cost of acquiring cyber capability is falling. AI is lowering some of the barriers to entry. More countries are discovering that cyber gives them leverage, and private companies are increasingly operating the infrastructure that governments consider strategically important. So I don't think the biggest cyber risk over the next few years is necessarily going to be some spectacular Hollywood-style attack. It may be something much quieter, a company discovering that someone has been inside its network for 6 months, a telecom operator discovering that its infrastructure has been compromised, a subsea cable going offline, or a company discovering, perhaps too late, that it has become strategically important to a government it never intended to deal with. And that, to me, is the most important change. The battlefield has moved. It isn't sitting exclusively inside government networks anymore. It's inside the commercial infrastructure that the entire global economy depends on. And if you run a company, sit on a board, or manage critical infrastructure, or simply depend on the internet to live and work, you're already part of the story. If you found this analysis useful, subscribe. I cover the intersection of geopolitics, energy, markets, technology, and the forces reshaping the global economy. And I try to focus on what the headlines mean rather than simply repeating them. Because increasingly, the most important risks are the ones nobody's talking about yet. Thank you.